For most of the 20th century, when an airliner went down inside the Soviet Union, the world simply never found out. The state closed the curtain, buried the report, and let the lessons die with the passengers. Behind that silence sits a long record of disasters every bit as shocking as anything in the West, kept hidden for decades. These are the crashes the Soviet Union and the Russia that followed never wanted you to see. 250,000 people had come to watch the Soviet Union win. They filled an airfield outside Paris in the summer of 1973, drawn by the most glamorous machine of the age, a supersonic airliner that could carry passengers faster than a rifle bullet. The Soviets had built one to rival the West's, and they had flown it to France to prove their technology was the equal of anything the capitalist world could produce. For a few minutes that afternoon, the crowd watched the sleek white jet climb and turn against the sky. Then they watched it break apart and fall in pieces onto the town below. The airplane was a Tupolev, the Soviet answer to the Concorde, so similar in shape that Western journalists mockingly nicknamed it the Concordsky. Beneath the resemblance, it was a cruder machine, thirstier and louder and shorter-legged than its Western twin. On the surface, it was magnificent, and Soviet prestige was riding on it. At the air show that year, the two supersonic rivals were placed in direct competition, flying their displays one after the other for the same crowd. On that final day, the Tupolev was scheduled to take to the air right after Concorde had finished dazzling the spectators. Whatever happened next, the Soviet crew knew they could not afford to be outshone. The Tupolev's display began smoothly enough. It thundered down the runway, climbed away, and swept past the crowd in a graceful pass with its drooping nose lowered. Then, near the end of its routine, the jet did something violent and unexpected. It suddenly pitched up and clawed for the sky in a steep, powerful climb, far harder than anything in the planned sequence. At the top, the airplane seemed to stall and stagger. Then its nose dropped, and it fell into a near vertical dive, plunging back toward the rooftops with its engines screaming. For a moment, it looked as though the crew might save it. They hauled back on the controls, and the jet began to level out just above the town, so low that people on the ground could see it filling the sky. But the strain of pulling out of that dive was more than the airframe could bear. The outer part of the left wing tore away, the jet rolled and flipped onto its back, and the fuselage broke apart in the air. Trailing fire, the pieces fell onto the streets and houses of a quiet suburb north of the airfield. All 6 men aboard the Tupolev were lost. So were 8 people on the ground, among them children, when the wreckage smashed into more than a dozen homes. Dozens more were injured. In an instant, in front of the world's cameras and 250,000 horrified onlookers, the Soviet Union's proudest aviation showpiece had become a field of burning debris in a French town. What had made the airplane throw itself into that fatal maneuver became one of the great mysteries of aviation, and the Cold War made sure it stayed that way. The most enduring theory points to a second aircraft in the sky that day. A French Mirage fighter had gone up to photograph the rival Concorde, and there is reason to believe the Soviet crew were never warned it was there. If the pilots suddenly caught sight of the fighter close by, they may have hauled their jet into that desperate climb to avoid it, and overstressed it beyond saving. The official inquiry settled nothing. French and Soviet experts examined the wreckage together, and many months later they issued only a brief joint statement. They had found nothing wrong with the airplane's design, they said, so the cause most likely lay with the human beings flying it. Beyond that, they declared, the true cause could not be identified. The full report was never released to the public. To this day, more than 50 years later, no one can say for certain why the jet fell. For 7 years, a man in a forgotten corner of the Russian Arctic had been mowing the grass on a runway no airplane ever used. The little airfield at Izhma had been closed to airliners since 2003, left to helicopters and silence, its strip slowly surrendering to the tundra. But the man in charge of it could not bring himself to let it rot. Year after year, he cleared away the saplings and the brush and kept the old pavement swept, tending a runway to nowhere out of nothing more than stubborn pride. He had no way of knowing that one September morning, 81 strangers would owe him their lives. That morning, a Tupolev was crossing the vast emptiness of northern Russia, carrying 72 passengers and 9 crew from a diamond mining town in the Far East toward Moscow. The jet was old but sound, cruising peacefully above the clouds at 34,000 feet, when its electrical system quietly began to die. The cause, it later turned out, was the aircraft's batteries, which had overheated and run away with themselves, taking the entire electrical network down with them. In a matter of moments, the crew lost almost everything that made the airplane modern. The radios went silent. The navigation screens went dark. They could no longer talk to anyone on the ground or see where they were on any instrument. And worst of all, the electric pumps that fed fuel from the wings to the engines stopped working, leaving them only the small reserve already sitting in the supply tank, perhaps 30 minutes of flight. They were hundreds of kilometers from any major airport, blind and nearly mute, with a clock now running on the fuel that remained. The captain and first officer turned the airplane in the rough direction of where they believed help might lie, descending below the cloud to find the ground with their own eyes. And there, against all reason, they spotted it. A thin gray line cut through the endless green of the taiga, following the bend of a river. It was a runway, improbably clear and clean, the only flat refuge for hundreds of kilometers in any direction. It was the airfield at Izhma, the one a single caretaker had refused to let die. But finding it was only half the battle. The same electrical failure that had blinded them had also robbed them of their flaps and slats, the surfaces that let an airplane fly slowly and land short. Without them, the Tupolev had to come in far faster than normal, well over 350 kilometers an hour, and the strip below was barely a third the length a jet like this would normally need. The crew threw the airplane at it twice and had to pull away both times, unable to line up and lose enough height on such a short, unfamiliar runway. On the third attempt, with the fuel all but gone, they committed. They came down hard and fast on that little Arctic strip. The Tupolev touched the pavement and the crew stood on the brakes, but at that speed, on that short a runway, there was never any chance of stopping in time. The jet thundered off the end of the pavement and plowed on into the low forest beyond, mowing down small trees as it went, until at last it shuddered to a halt amid the brush, scarred and battered but still upright on its wheels. It had overrun the runway by only a couple of 100 meters, and then, the most important detail of all, nobody was hurt. All 81 people aboard climbed down the slides into the cool Arctic air, shaken but alive. While they waited in the wilderness for rescue, some of the passengers, with the unbothered calm that the moment hardly seemed to call for, wandered off into the trees to pick mushrooms. Helicopters eventually ferried them out to the nearest town, and from there another airplane carried them on to Moscow. Two of them, having had quite enough of flying for one day, chose to finish the journey by train. The two pilots were made heroes of the Russian Federation, the rest of the crew decorated for their courage, and the quiet caretaker who had spent 7 years tending an abandoned runway was honored too. His stubbornness recast at last as foresight, but the strangest twist in this tale was still to come. When engineers examined the battered Tupolev where it sat in the forest, they decided it could be saved. They stripped it down to the barest possible weight, replaced 2 of its 3 engines, and the following spring, a team of test pilots eased the repaired jet off that same short strip, lifting away after only 800 meters of the runway it should never have been able to use. The airplane went back into service for years, and now rests in a museum, named for the village that saved it. 7 years before this airplane fell, its twin had already shown the world exactly how it would die. In the spring of 1980, another Polish jet of the very same type had climbed away from Warsaw, lost an engine in a single violent burst, and dropped out of the sky moments later, taking 87 lives. The cause was a flaw buried deep inside a Soviet-built engine. The fix was obvious, and yet, on a May morning 7 years on, the lessons of that first disaster had gone so thoroughly unlearned that a second fuller airplane was about to repeat it almost detail for detail, this time over half an hour of slow and public agony. The airplane was an Ilyushin, the long-range pride of the Eastern Bloc, bound from Warsaw to New York on a rare and nearly full transatlantic service. There were 183 people aboard, and an unusually large flight crew of 6 up front, led by a veteran captain with more than 19,000 hours behind him. They had climbed out normally, threading between military zones at the controller's request, and were passing through 26,000 feet when the back of the airplane tore itself apart. One of the 4 rear-mounted engines had suffered a catastrophic internal failure. A heavy shaft inside it, weakened by a worn bearing, had snapped, letting a turbine spin wildly out of control until it exploded. White-hot fragments scythed in every direction. One destroyed the engine beside it. Another ripped through the fuselage, severing the cables that moved the airplane's elevators, the very surfaces the pilots needed to control whether the nose pointed up or down. In a single instant, the crew lost half their engines, their cabin pressure, much of their electrical power, and their primary means of pitch control. They did not yet know the worst of it. A glowing chunk of metal had also lodged in the rear cargo hold, where it had quietly started a fire. What followed was a half-hour fight against a slowly tightening noose. The pilots discovered they could still nudge the nose up and down using the trimmable tail, a clumsy substitute for the controls they had lost, and with it they steadied their descent. They turned back toward Warsaw and began the desperate work of dumping fuel, because they were far too heavy to land. But the damage to their wiring meant the fuel valves would barely open, and their remaining generator could not power everything at once, so they switched off system after system just to keep the airplane flying. Then came the fateful choice. A military airfield called Modlin lay closer, and the controller offered it to them. For a while, they aimed for it, but as the fuel finally streamed away and the airplane grew lighter and easier to hold, the crew began to feel they had time, and they reasoned that the big airport at Warsaw, with its longer runway and better fire crews, was the safer place to bring down a crippled jet. So they passed up the closer field and turned for home. What none of them understood was that their airplane was already burning, and had been for many minutes, the alarm that should have warned them silenced by the same flying debris that had cut their controls. For 31 minutes they coaxed the wounded Ilyushin across Poland, calm and professional, even as the situation slowly slipped beyond their reach. They prepared the cabin. They discussed the wind and the runway. The end came as they turned onto their final approach. Just minutes from the runway they had crossed half the country to reach. The fire finally won. Something gave way at the back of the airplane, the nose pitched down, and there was no longer any trim or skill that could stop it. The last words from the cockpit, broadcast over the radio for the world to hear, were a goodbye. The Ilyushin plunged into a forest on the edge of the city, 5 kilometers short of safety, and was gone in an instant. All 183 people aboard were lost. The worst air disaster in Poland's history. When investigators recovered the shattered engine, they found the same broken shaft, the same overspeeding turbine, the same fatal pattern as the crash 7 years before. The flaw lay in Soviet workmanship, in a bearing built with half the rollers it was supposed to have. But the deeper failure was the one that always seemed to haunt these machines behind the Iron Curtain. The first disaster had been quietly investigated and quietly filed away, its lessons treated not as a warning to be shared, but as an embarrassment to be managed. Even after this second tragedy, Moscow at first insisted the fault lay anywhere but in its factories, and only changed its position when yet another of its engines failed months later. The strangest part of this disaster is that the airplane was trying to take off and land at the same time. An Airbus full of people touched down safely in the Siberian dawn on a long runway with room to spare, and then simply refused to stop. It raced down the pavement at the speed of a takeoff, the pilots hauling on the brakes in mounting panic, unable to understand why their own jet would not slow down. The answer was sitting right under the captain's hand the entire time, and neither pilot ever saw it. Flight 778 was a red-eye from Moscow to Irkutsk, more than 4,000 kilometers and 4 time zones across Russia, all of it inside a single country. The wide-body jet was nearly full, with around 200 people aboard, flown by an experienced captain and a first officer still fairly new to the type. They had been awake all night. As they began their descent at dawn, the captain had remarked to a controller that they were short on sleep, a small confession that would matter more than it seemed. The airplane itself was tired too. In its last 100 or so flight hours, it had logged dozens of faults, many of them never fixed, and on this morning, its left thrust reverser was deliberately disabled, tagged out of service. That was no great problem on its own. The plan was simple. On landing, the captain would use only the right reverser to help slow the airplane and leave the left one alone. They touched down on the wet runway in good order. The captain pulled back the right reverse lever, and the engine roared into reverse. And for a few seconds, everything was normal. Then, as he eased that lever forward again to smooth out the rollout, the edge of his palm brushed the throttle of the left engine and nudged it forward. It was the smallest of movements, but it told the left engine to spool up, and within seconds that engine was pushing the airplane forward with more than half of takeoff power, even as the right one wound down. Now the jet was fighting itself, and the machine made it worse. Sensing one engine surging toward takeoff thrust, the airplane assumed it was being asked to fly, and it pulled the ground spoilers back in and released the automatic brakes. Then a takeoff warning began blaring through the cockpit, insisting they were not set up to take off. To the crew, it made no sense, because they were landing, and the first officer simply switched the alarm off and dismissed it as a glitch. He even radioed the tower to report a safe landing. None of them grasped that one of their own engines was now driving them down the runway. The deceleration stopped. Then the airplane began to speed up. Halfway down the runway, the captain finally felt that something was wrong and asked what was happening, and the first officer could only answer that the engine readings were climbing. The captain called for reverse again and stamped on the brakes with everything he had, but the surging left engine would not allow the reverser to deploy, a built-in safeguard now working against them. For a few seconds, the heavy braking and the engine thrust canceled out, and the jet hung at a steady speed as the end of the runway rushed toward them. They ran out of pavement at 180 kilometers an hour. The captain shouted to shut down the engines, but the first officer frozen, never touched them. The jet tore across the grass, smashed through a 3-meter concrete wall that ripped away its landing gear and part of a wing, and plowed into a cluster of private garages as fuel ignited. It came to rest broken and burning between the rooftops of a quiet district of the city. Almost everyone survived the impact itself. What they could not survive was the fire. Thick black smoke filled the cabin within seconds, and most of the doors could not be opened. A few flight attendants forced exits and dragged people out across a wing and through the smoke, saving dozens in under a minute before the flames swept end to end. Of the 203 people aboard, 78 escaped. The rest, overcome by smoke before they could reach an exit, did not. Both pilots were among the dead. What the investigation uncovered was almost unbearable in its simplicity. Had either man shut down that left engine in the first 25 seconds, the brakes and spoilers would have come back by themselves, and the airplane would have stopped on the runway with ease. But the captain had been rushed onto this Western jet straight from an old Soviet airliner, promoted to command with barely 40 hours on the type, trained on a cockpit that once carried a flight engineer to mind the throttles for him. Exhausted, certain the flight was already over, and unprepared for a problem he had never been taught to expect, he never thought to look at the one lever that was killing them all. Tomorrow was the captain's 28th birthday, and he wanted to be home for it. He had flown into Tyumen just before midnight, slept a few hours in an airport hotel while freezing rain and snow fell over the city, and come back at dawn for the short hop to Surgut and back, the last thing standing between him and a day off with his family. He was 27, his first officer just 24, and neither of them gave much thought to the thin skin of ice forming silently on the wings of their airplane in the dark. The airplane was a French-built turboprop, a high-winged machine well suited to the rough runways of Siberia, but with one quiet trap built into that design. Because the wings sat up on the roof, no one standing on the ground could see the top of them without a ladder. That morning, the technician who inspected the airplane never found a ladder, and neither did the captain on his walk-around. They checked the engines and the sensors, found them clean and free of ice, and reasoned that if those were clear, the wings surely were too. So the technician boarded the airplane and told the captain there was no ice. Pleased, the captain decided they would skip de-icing and take off as they were. Every sign pointed the other way. Snow lay fresh across the whole airport. The temperature hovered right in the band where ice clings to metal. Nearly every other airplane on the ramp that morning was being sprayed before departure. But the captain had been given a clean report by the ground crew, and he had no reason on paper to doubt it, so the turboprop pushed back with at least 4 millimeters of ice coating the tops of its wings and tail. As they taxied out, the captain switched on the airplane's own de-icing system, the inflatable rubber strips along the front edges of the wings, and watched a crust of ice crack and slide away. It should have told him everything. Instead, it told him nothing, because those strips only clear the leading edge, and he did not grasp that ice was still sitting across the rest of the wing where nothing could reach it. Satisfied the system worked, he switched it off and lined up to depart. The takeoff looked normal at first, but the ice was already at work, forcing the airplane to climb at a steeper angle than usual and tugging strangely at the controls, so much that the captain rolled in full nose-down trim just to hold a normal attitude. He noticed the odd behavior. He simply did not connect it to ice, and the climb continued. Then came the single action that turned a flyable airplane into a falling one. Passing the normal speed for it, the first officer raised the flaps. On a clean wing, this is routine. On this wing, it was fatal. The extended flaps had been quietly masking the damage the ice was doing, and the instant they came up, the speed at which the wing would stall leapt upward until it matched, almost exactly, the angle the airplane was flying at that very moment. Nothing about the airplane's path through the sky had changed. Yet in that instant, it went from climbing steadily to teetering on the edge of a stall, and a heartbeat later, it began to shudder and roll. The pilots had no idea what was happening. The buffeting and the sudden roll did not look like any stall they had practiced, because their training stalls always crept up slowly with falling speed, and this one arrived out of nowhere with the speed unchanged. They thought something had broken, and the first officer shouted back that he did not even know what the failure was. The wing dropped hard, the airplane rolled past 60 degrees and started to fall, and the captain did the one thing that made it worse, hauling back on the controls as the ground rushed up, fighting even the automatic system that was trying to push the nose down and save them. 64 seconds after leaving the runway, the turboprop hit a snowy field, cartwheeled, and burst into flames. Of the 43 people aboard, 33 were lost, including all 4 crew. That 10 survived at all owed much to the deep snow that swallowed the wreckage. What the investigators uncovered was less a single blunder than a system quietly set up to fail. The young pilots had been drilled endlessly on ice that forms in flight, and taught almost nothing about ice that forms on a parked airplane, for the simple reason that Siberia is usually too cold for it to stick. This was the captain's first flight all winter that even called for de-icing. The aircraft manual that explained the danger was written in English, a language neither could really read, having passed a course that barely went beyond radio phrases. The ground handler who declared the wings clean had been trained off the street in 30 minutes, where a proper course ran 16 hours. And behind it all sat an airline expanding so fast it was burning its pilots out and papering over its own safety numbers. It was, in the end, a very modern Russian kind of accident, where every separate corner that got cut was perfectly legal, right up until they all met in a snowy field. The man truly flying this airplane was not the captain. He was the navigator, and he was the most experienced person in the cockpit by a wide margin, with a quarter century and 13,000 hours on the type, more than the other 3 pilots put together. When he spoke, they listened. When he told the captain where to turn and when to descend, the captain obeyed. The trouble was that on this particular night, the man whose word had become law in that cockpit was drunk. The flight should never have been his to command, or even to fly at all. It was a last-minute charter, thrown together in a few hours after a regional airline's regular jet broke down and stranded its passengers. To rescue the schedule, the airline borrowed an aircraft and crew from a charter company, and what they got was an aging Tupolev, a relic designed in the Soviet 60s, sent north from Moscow toward a small city near the Finnish border. 4 pilots crowded the flight deck that night. All of them had just come off 2 days of rest, and the navigator had spent part of that break drinking, boarding the airplane with more alcohol in his blood than the law would allow behind the wheel of a car. Their destination was a problem in its own right. The little airport had no modern landing system, forcing the crew to fly an old and unloved type of approach that meant tracking a pair of radio beacons by hand in order to find the runway in the dark. It was demanding work, even when sober. But the navigator wasn't tracking the beacons at all. He was secretly relying on a handheld satellite navigator, a device that was never approved for guiding an airplane down to a runway because following it was simply easier than doing the job the proper way. That shortcut hid a deadly flaw. The coordinates fed into that little device placed the airport more than 100 meters away from where it actually stood. As the crew swung onto their final heading, the navigator chased the false position on his screen, correcting and recorrecting for a wind that was fading away, never realizing he was steering the airplane steadily off to one side of the runway. His instruments showed them perfectly on course. They were not, and not one of the other pilots cross-checked the beacons that would have revealed the truth, because they trusted him completely. Worse still, no one knew what the weather was really doing. The airport's outdated equipment reported a comfortable cloud base, high enough to see the runway in plenty of time. But a bend in the river and a patch of forest had brewed a bank of dense fog directly over the approach. Fog the airport's lone observer stationed at the wrong end of the field never saw. The true cloud base was around 100 feet, far below the level at which the crew were legally required to abandon the landing. The captain flew the whole approach, expecting to break out of the cloud and see the runway laid out before him. He never grasped that he was already far below the point where he should have given up. So the airplane kept descending into the gray. The navigator, dulled by alcohol, missed the call he was supposed to make to warn the captain that they were nearing their limit. The flight engineer dutifully read out their height as it melted away, 60 meters, then 40, his voice falling into a cockpit where no one was truly listening. The captain stared out into the fog, searching for a runway that was off to his right and far below him, certain it would appear at any second. It never did. What appeared instead were the tops of the trees. The Tupolev clipped them with its wing, rolled over onto its back, and flew on inverted for more than half a kilometer before it slammed upside down into a road on the edge of the city, broke apart, and caught fire. The wreckage came to rest behind a row of country cottages, several hundred meters short of the runway the crew had spent their last minutes chasing. Local people reached the burning wreck before the airport even understood what had happened, because the falling jet had cut the power line that fed the field, plunging the runway lights into darkness. Rescuers and neighbors pulled a handful of people from the flames before an explosion drove them back. Of the 52 aboard, 47 were lost. Among the 5 who somehow lived was a 14-year-old girl, who survived without her mother and her little brother. The investigation found a sober airplane could have flown this approach and lived. The fog, the broken weather equipment, the old jet with no ground warning system, all of it mattered. But at the center of it sat one ruinous fact. A cockpit where the real authority had quietly drifted to the most senior voice in the room, and that voice belonged to a man too impaired to do the very job everyone was trusting him to do. They had all placed their lives in his hands, and assumed, right up to the trees, that he had everything under control. 1,000 kilometers from the North Pole, on a frozen Norwegian archipelago, the Soviet Union had built a little world of its own. The mining town of Pyramiden clung to the edge of the Arctic, and its Russian and Ukrainian families had everything the state could give them: a heated pool, a theater, a grand piano shipped to the top of the world, even soil hauled in from Siberia so that grass could grow on the barren rock. Twice a year, a chartered jet connected this remote outpost to Moscow, carrying miners and their loved ones home and back again. On a late summer day in 1996, 120 of those families drove to the airport to welcome the incoming flight. It would never land. The airplane was a Tupolev, flown by a Russian carrier that had splintered off from the old Soviet airline after the Union collapsed. Aboard were 141 people, most of them connected in some way to that tight-knit mining community at the far edge of the map. The crew had flown to the islands before and had even rehearsed the approach in a simulator beforehand. By every reasonable measure, they were prepared. What undid them was not the weather or the machine, but a thin and treacherous gap in understanding that opened the moment they began talking to the ground. The little airport at Longyearbyen had no air traffic controller. What it had was an information officer, a man permitted only to pass along advice, not to issue commands. In the Soviet system, no such role had ever existed, and so the Russian crew assumed the voice on the radio held the same authority as a controller back home. The two sides also had to speak to each other in English, a language none of the pilots truly commanded beyond a handful of standard phrases. When the crew tried to say they wanted to land in one direction, their broken phrasing was misread, and the officer mentioned that the runway in use was the opposite one. The pilots took this scrap of advice as a direct order. In an instant, they threw away the careful plan they had just briefed and started over, committing themselves to a difficult approach they had never rehearsed. This new approach was a demanding one. It required flying down the center of a valley walled in by 3,000-foot mountains on either side, then making a sharp turn at the last moment to line up with the runway. There was no instrument landing system to guide them down, and no radar to watch over them. To fly it safely, the crew needed to be calm, coordinated, and certain of their position. They were none of those things. The navigator, already overloaded, was now wrestling with the radio in a language he barely spoke while trying to steer the airplane onto an unfamiliar path, and in his haste, he made a small, fatal error. He programmed his navigation unit with the wrong final course, one that failed to account for the angled approach. From that moment, the two men guiding the airplane were living in different realities. The navigator's instrument told him they were drifting to the left of where they should be, so he kept urging the airplane to the right. The captain's instrument, correctly set, told him the opposite, that they had strayed too far right and needed to come back left. Neither realized they were reading different truths from different screens. They began to argue, the captain insisting on left, the navigator insisting on right, the airplane creeping ever further toward the mountain wall on the valley's edge. At last, the captain simply gave way, telling the navigator to guide them. It was the worst possible moment to surrender, because the navigator was steering them straight at a mountain. For all the confusion, there were warnings, and there was time. The first officer kept asking aloud where they were, whether the approach was even correct, the kind of questions that should have stopped everything. Not once did anyone suggest the obvious safe choice, to abandon the approach, climb to a safe height, and sort it out with clear air beneath them. They had fixed their minds on landing, and they could not let go of it. Then the ground proximity alarm tried to save them, but only its warning light came on while its voice stayed silent, and the puzzled crew hesitated for a precious second or two. By the time a second alarm jolted them into action, and they hauled back on the controls, the flat gray face of the mountain was already filling the windscreen. The Tupolev struck the icy summit at a steep angle and shattered in an instant. The forward section was flung up onto the plateau while the tail tumbled off the cliff into the chasm below, and the impact shook loose an avalanche that swept across the wreckage moments after it stopped. There were no witnesses, only the slow dread of the families waiting at the airport for a flight that never appeared. By early afternoon, the answer came. The wreckage lay on the mountaintop, and all 141 people aboard had died on impact. For the community on the islands, it was a blow from which it never recovered. As many as 1 in 7 residents of Pyramiden were gone, and those left behind had each lost friends and family. Within 2 years, the mine, the strategic foothold, the whole improbable Soviet town at the top of the world, was abandoned. Its books and bottles and machinery left where they sat. The investigation laid the cause at the crew's feet, at their poor English, their confusion over who was really in command, the missed chances to simply climb away. But beneath all of it lay something larger, a crew shaped by one closed and rigid system, sent out into a wider world whose plainest rules they had never been taught to read. More than 4 decades, and a single thread running through all of it. We began over Paris, with a supersonic jet that fell out of the sky in front of the world, and a cause that was quietly buried before anyone outside the Kremlin could ask too many questions. We ended on a Moscow runway in the modern age, with a fly-by-wire airliner burning in front of a packed terminal, and a report so vast it took 6 years to write. Between those 2 points lies the whole arc of a system, the way it rose, the way it fell apart, and the way its faults outlived the country that created them. What ties these crashes together is not the machines, though the machines have their own story to tell. It is something quieter and harder to fix. In the Soviet years, a plane crash was not a problem to be solved, but a fact to be managed, a thing to be kept out of the newspapers and away from foreign eyes. When a flaw appeared inside an engine, the instinct was not to warn the world, but to protect the reputation of the state that built it. And so the same flaw was allowed to wait, patiently, for the next airplane and the next crew, because admitting it the first time was simply unthinkable. A lesson that cannot be spoken aloud is a lesson that has to be learned again, in blood, every single time. When the Union collapsed, the secrecy lifted, but the rot did not. The state airlines shattered into dozens of new companies overnight, hungry for profit and short on everything else. They bought Western jets their pilots had never been trained to truly understand, and handed them documents written in a language those pilots could barely read. They promoted men into cockpits they were not ready for, cut corners that were somehow always technically legal, and reported safety numbers that looked good on paper and meant nothing in the air. The danger was no longer a single broken part. It was 1,000 small compromises, each one defensible on its own, all of them waiting for the day they would meet. And meet they did. A crew arguing over a mountain because no one had taught them to simply climb away and start over. A captain who flew a healthy jet off the end of a runway because the system had rushed him into a seat he had not earned. A navigator running a cockpit by force of seniority while too impaired to be behind the wheel of a car. A young crew taking off into the dark with ice on their wings, undone by a 30-minute training course, and a manual they could not read. None of these people set out to die. They were carried there, step by step, by everyone and everything that had failed them, long before they ever reached the runway. There is one airplane in this video that did not end in fire, and it is worth remembering why. A jet went dark over the tundra, lost almost everything, and still came home because 2 pilots kept their heads, and a single man, far from anywhere, had spent 7 lonely years refusing to let an abandoned runway disappear. That is the other half of the truth. The same system that produced so much tragedy also produced extraordinary people who again and again did the impossible with what little they were given. The failures were never theirs alone, and neither were the miracles. Today, Russian aviation is safer than it was, and the worst of these patterns belong mostly to the past. But the deeper lesson outlives any one country. Every rule in the sky is written because someone, somewhere, paid for it first. The only thing more dangerous than a mistake is the decision to hide it, because a truth buried in the wreckage does not stay buried, it waits. And sooner or later, it comes back to be paid in full. That is all for this one. If you made it this far, odds are you love this kind of deep dive as much as we do, so hit subscribe and stick around. We have got a lot more of these coming, and the next one is never far behind.